These pictures are just fucking terrible. They do not do a good job of explaining this in a simple manner.
Let the gate be open to die. I shall meet death head on. I shall meet death head on.
I am John Beckmann, Professor John Beckmann, Dr. John Beckmann, the father of Sid, the transgenic mother of Sin, your hostess with the mostest. Get a green screen in the back. Tea, Earl Grey, make it so. I want to talk today about this hydrogen hypothesis for the first eukaryote. So I first came across this paper in a book called Power, Sex, Suicide. Power, Sex, Suicide by Nick Lane. This was a great book. I read it a while ago, so it's a little bit rusty, but I have a chapter that I assigned for reading in my biotechnology class. So periodically I'll come back to it and I'll reread sections of it. It's a really good book. The premise of this book is that it discusses a few things. It discusses the origins of life. It discusses origins of the first eukaryote. So eukaryote would be the first organism that developed a nucleus, how the first organism developed a nucleus. And within this, it discusses the hydrogen hypothesis, which the book presents as kind of like the most logical pathway explaining the origins of the first eukaryote. It also discusses origins of sex. And the premise of the book is that the acquisition of the mitochondria led to the first eukaryote. Okay, the mitochondria essentially like solved a problem in that eukaryotic cells are much larger than prokaryotic cells. And there's a problem with the surface to volume ratio. Okay, as the cell gets bigger and bigger and bigger, bigger and bigger and bigger, compare this cell to this cell. As the cell gets bigger and bigger and bigger, the amount of membrane that surrounds this volume is not large enough to diffuse enough nutrients into the cell to support the cell. Okay, so small cells are small. The reason they're small is because they can get the nutrients they need passed around in the cell through passive, essentially like diffusion. Okay, like once and things are not necessarily diffusing across the membrane, but once they're inside the cell, like they can diffuse around enough, the nutrients can spread around enough. And the surface area of the membrane in a small cell is large enough that the amount of nutrients passing through that membrane can support the life of the cell. The problem for eukaryotes is that this surface area to volume ratio, let's see. So if I actually like mathematically write this out, so the surface area divided by the volume. As the volume gets larger and larger and larger, this ratio goes down. Okay, so as volume goes up, this ratio goes down and down and down. And as this ratio goes down, there's not enough area for enough nutrients to pass through this membrane to keep the cell healthy. Okay, it's physically impossible. Like if you like the physics equations, it's actually like physically impossible. Okay, you can't get enough nutrients in the cell to support that volume. So eukaryotes figured out a way to solve this problem. The way that they solve this problem is they absorb smaller cells. And when I say cells, I'm abstracting a little bit here. They're evolved since then. That we call mitochondria. And if you are familiar with biology, everybody always says the mitochondria is the powerhouse, the ATP production. It's the energy factory within the cell. So once the eukaryotic cell was able to essentially like internalize mitochondria, and it's thought that mitochondria are derived from small bacteria. So it's thought that the first eukaryotic cell essentially like absorbed a prototypical mitochondria. And once that happened, these cells could then produce energy inside the cell, and not everything had to diffuse across the membrane. So that is essentially like the problem, the great filter that the eukaryotic organism had to solve, the surface to volume ratio problem. And the mitochondria are the source of this solution. Okay, so this book talks a lot about the origins of the first eukaryote, how this process happened, how the mitochondria was absorbed into the first prototypical eukaryotic cell to produce this effect. Okay, and I guess in general, just in general, more the premise of the book is that this event, which is related, that's the word, that's what's being referred to in the word power in the title. This event, which was the production of now power within inside the cell, led to the evolution of sex, because sex is very expensive. Now we have extra energy, led to the evolution of sex, which then in the end ends up killing us because there are toxic side effects of having these mitochondria in our cell producing energy. Essentially, that's kind of like the big premise of this book. And I like it a lot because it has a lot of discussions about origins of the first things, the first few things. And I'm really obsessed with thinking about origins of first things. I think it's a really fascinating question. So I'm kind of becoming obsessed now with thinking about origins of life. I like this idea of the origin of the first eukaryote and how it happened, origins of sex. These are all very, very interesting to me. Okay, so that's how I first heard about this publication. This publication is essentially like the framework for which Power, Sex, Suicide talks about the origin of the first eukaryote. But I've never actually read the actual Nature publication. So I thought today that I would dig in, read this publication, and see what I think. Let's unpack this sentence from the abstract. This is the hypothesis. So this is a direct quote. This is the main thing. Let's try to unpack this. Reading this myself, it's even a little bit difficult. Okay. Eukaryotes are suggested to have arisen through symbiotic association of an anaerobic, so there's a whole bunch of keywords here, anaerobic, hydrogen-dependent, autotrophic archaeobacterium. Okay, let's unpack these. Eukaryote is from Eukaryota. They are cells with things inside. They have a nucleus, which is the defining characteristic, but they also have like cytoskeletons, organelles, and mitochondria, importantly. Or if you're a plant cell, chloroplast. Okay, so that's a eukaryote. If you look at the domains of life, it's prokaryota, archaea, eukaryota. These are the three main domains of life. So when we were taught kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species in high school, this has since been superseded with a hierarchy at the top called domains. The three domains are prokaryota, archaea, and eukaryota. And archaea is kind of in between. We're more closely related to archaea than we are to prokaryota, which are the bacteria. So we've defined archaeobacterium. Okay, so an archaeobacterium is one of these three domains of life, or that's archaea. Anaerobic is without oxygen. Autotrophic, I think this is, it can produce its own energy. They don't consume. Okay, that's in contrast to heterotrophic, which are, the heterotrophs are the organisms that do consume other organisms. Okay, so eukaryotes are suggested to have arisen through a symbiotic association of an anaerobic, without oxygen, strictly hydrogen dependent, so that it needs hydrogen, strictly autotrophic, can produce its own energy, archaeobacterium, the host. So it's saying, let's color code this. Let's say the archaea are the host with a eubacterium. Eubacteria is the same thing as prokaryota. So the hypothesis is there's this symbiosis between this archaea, which is autotrophic, and a prokaryote, and it produces hydrogen as a byproduct. So the idea is that this prokaryote is producing hydrogen, something that the archaea likes. I think I say this in a different lecture. Essentially, what the idea is that the prokaryote is producing something that the archaea likes. And so they continually get closer and closer and closer and closer until eventually the archaea just absorbs the prokaryote and they live together after getting closer and closer and closer and closer. Okay, I pulled out the book because I really need some help understanding this paper. One of the key things that is written about that you need to understand in describing this hypothesis is what are hydrogenosomes. That's a key point. Okay, hydrogenosomes are mitochondria-like organelles, and they are found in very primitive eukaryotes. Very, very primitive eukaryotes, okay? And they produce hydrogen as a byproduct. Now, understanding that hydrogenosomes are an organelle derived from or similar to mitochondria in these primitive eukaryotes is important because they're looking at primitive eukaryotes and they're trying to figure out, okay, well, what's in these primitive eukaryotes that might be kind of like the missing link? And they think it's that this one of these missing links is this hydrogenosome. So the fact that it produces hydrogen as a byproduct is important because they release hydrogen gas into their surroundings. So then they start to think, okay, then they sort of start to think, well, what could be the source of those primitive eukaryotic hydrogenosomes? What could be the source of those hydrogenosomes? So I think the way that this hypothesis evolves is the researchers are thinking about these hydrogenosomes, which produce hydrogen and carbon dioxide. And they're thinking about like, well, where could this have come from? And how could it get inside of a cell? So they first start thinking through, well, what are cells that need these things? Okay. And they come up with this methanogen, which is an archaea. Methanogens use hydrogen. So they need hydrogen and CO2 to produce methane. So they need these reagents, which a hydrogenosome is in theory producing. And so then the hypothesis evolves to, well, what could be the prototypical hydrogenosome? And if you take an alpha proteobacteria, which can have mixed bags of metabolism, okay? And there are certain situations under anaerobic, I would spell it wrong. Anaerobic conditions, under anaerobic conditions that can produce hydrogen and CO2, okay? So there exist organisms that under anaerobic conditions can produce hydrogen and CO2, and there exist methanogen organisms, archaea, that under certain conditions need hydrogen and CO2 to produce methane, okay? So then the hypothesis just becomes, well, just put two and two together, okay? You have this methanogen that needs these things, which this alpha proteobacterium is producing. And so eventually the relationship gets closer and closer and closer, where the methanogen just starts hugging these alpha proteobacteria because they're producing the nutrients that it needs. And then down the stream, eventually it just ends up absorbing this alpha proteobacteria. Here's what I don't understand about the hydrogen hypothesis, though. I've been researching it now for an hour and a half, reading everything I can read on it. It's not clear to me what the alpha proteobacteria gets out of this. So in terms of like an endosymbiosis, I still don't understand it because I see how the methanogen is getting what it needs, but I still don't understand what the alpha proteobacteria is getting out of the arrangement. Why would this be beneficial to the alpha proteobacteria? I can't figure that out yet. So if you know, write it in the comments, write it in the chats. Maybe you can help clarify a little bit. It's been a difficult hypothesis for me to understand, but I think I'm at the point where I kind of understand it now. Okay, and a final like criticism of this hypothesis was that it could only work under anaerobic conditions. And so this is what led to the thought that life evolved in the hot vents in the ocean, or that I guess the first eukaryote evolved in the hot vents in the ocean where there's a lack of oxygen, because you need a lack of oxygen in the environment. And during this time on the earth, oxygen was rising. So the conundrum is oxygen is rising on the earth, but the hypothesis for the first eukaryote, the best hypothesis, requires a lack of oxygen. So how does that happen? And the proposed hypothesis is that it's happening in these hydrogen vents where these associations actually happen. And so this is why people are really obsessed with the idea of the hydrogen vents in the origins of life and origins of the first eukaryote. This is a difficult paper.
Let the gate be time to die. I shall meet death head on. I shall meet death head on. Eukaryota, you've got to get out of here. Beware foul demons and beasts, there are many foes here. The time has come to cleanse my heart. This monastery reeks with evil and corruption. Oh, I hate staining my hands with the blood of foul sorcerers. Eternal suffering would be too great for you, Diablo. Let the gate be time to die. I shall meet death head on. I shall meet death head on. Eukaryota, you've got to get out of here. Beware foul demons and beasts, there are many foes here. The prime evils are no more. The prime evils are no more.
So how is this hypothesis different from other hypotheses out there? Hypotheses, let's call this extant hypotheses about the origin of euks. The first one they list is this archezoa. Archezoa hypothesis is that archaea and eukarya share a common ancestor. This is the archezoa hypothesis. This is the first part of this hypothesis. And then the second part of this hypothesis is that this branch point happened by a primitive ancestral eukaryote absorbing a bacteria. So this is the same idea. The alternative fusion hypothesis. Second hypothesis is the fusion hypothesis. What the fuck? How is that any different? I see. Okay, so there's two main hypotheses for the origin of eukaryotes, and they're both very similar. They both involve essentially like absorption or fusion of a eubacteria in an archaea, like we discussed. Both of these involve that. But the archezoa hypothesis suggests that a couple things happened first. First, a primitive eukaryote evolved a primitive nucleus, cytoskeleton, and endocytosis. Okay. And then downstream, terminal euks evolved after the absorption event, the endocytosis event. Okay. That's the archezoa hypothesis. These hypotheses are very, very similar. The fusion hypothesis, let me draw this tree again. The fusion hypothesis is that the absorption event happens directly from an archaea and causes the evolution of the nucleus and cytoskeleton, etc. Very, very subtle difference here. One is that the absorption event is causing this evolution, And the Archezoa hypothesis is that a primitive eukaryote evolves first and then downstream absorbs a bacteria to become the mitochondria. These two are different from the hydrogen hypothesis because both of these assume that the host is heterotrophic. It's like looking for things to eat, it's consuming. And the hydrogen hypothesis is unique from this consumption. It's not based on consumption, it's based on symbiosis and almost like mutually consenting absorption. Man, I thought I was going to assign this paper to my students. It's pretty difficult and nuanced. Okay, this is an important feature of the hydrogen hypothesis. An important feature is that it does not premise that the origin of the symbiosis between prokaryota and archaea was ATP production. It premises that it's hydrogen production, and it gives some evidence for this. The archaea can produce, it assumes that the archaea cannot produce ATP by themselves, whereas I think most can. Okay, that's this point one. It also premises that the symbiont produces ATP in exceeds of its needs. So like it's producing more than it needs, which is unlikely in nature. It's probably unlikely that it's producing excess. 3, the symbiont could export ATP to its environment. So not only would for this to be true that the symbiosis originated by the production of ATP inside the cell, that would imply that the organism was pumping ATP out into its environment, which would be highly unlikely because ATP is a very precious resource. It's like taking your money and like throwing it out into your yard. You would not do that. That would have to be far downstream evolved. It's saying that these 3 things are unknown amongst contemporary cells. These things are unknown amongst contemporary cells. So the hydrogen hypothesis, it avoids the assumption that ATP is the cause of the symbiosis. And then it starts to think, well, what might the archaea need? So it favors this idea that a waste product of the proteobacteria is the benefit to the archaea. This is probably ecologically more likely to happen because it sort of like it obeys the laws of kind of like selfish gene theory. These organisms can still be selfish and yet reap a symbiotic relationship. So the clear distinctions of the hydrogen hypothesis compared to Archezoa hypothesis and the fusion hypothesis is that the last 2 suggest ATP was source of symbiosis. Okay, in these 2 theories, it's suggesting that ATP production was the source of the symbiosis. But this paper describes why that's unlikely in these 3 points that I discussed before. And it's more likely, the symbiosis is more likely to occur, as the hydrogen hypothesis posits, if the 2 entities can get utility from the other's waste. I think that's the key. That's the key to the hydrogen hypothesis that makes it different. The 2 entities are getting utility from the other's waste products. That's the hydrogen hypothesis in a nutshell. These pictures are just fucking terrible. They do not do a good job of explaining this in a simple manner.